Welcome back. So we're gonna kick it off. If you've been following the community tab in my channel, you know I've been talking about the TD Ameritrade API client. I have been in the process of building this wonderful library for like the last 2 weeks. It's still not done entirely, but I would say 80% of it's pretty much good to go, and anything that's really going to be added are just different types of objects that I'll kind of explain what they're supposed to be doing. So this is going to be a relatively long series just because there is so much to this particular library. So I'm really dedicating the first video just giving you the context, the background, and really trying to lay the foundation as to what is it supposed to be doing and why are we doing certain things. That way, as we're coding it, it's going to give you some more context as to why I'm declaring certain objects or why I'm declaring certain methods or attributes, things along that nature where if you ever decide to go down the road and modify this library for some kind of need that you need, you'll kind of understand my approach and why I approached it the way I did. Now, this is not to say this is going to be a final product. There's definitely going to be some more changes before I probably post it on GitHub. It's probably going to be in its own dedicated repository, just as an FYI. But I would say as a foundation, this is probably what it's going to look like, give or take maybe some additional methods and maybe defining a little bit more in the sense of what type of arguments might be able to be passed through or something like that. So just to give you an idea of the scope and just how much code there is, this is just one of the files. So this is where the main client object is. So this is going to be doing, the client object basically does things like authentication. It's going to be doing things like caching your access token. So that way you don't have to authenticate yourself every single time. Or when I'm talking more about authentication, I mean logging in and providing passwords and usernames. So this will kind of handle that. And then more importantly, it's going to handle all the requests. So anything where we're going to be sending and receiving information from the API, the client will handle that. But just to give you an idea of just how much code there is, I am currently at 1600, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be more. In fact, I know there's going to be more. Now, be it most of this is probably just comments, but I really wanted to make sure it's detailed, and I wanted to make sure where if anyone looked at this code, you're not going why and how and understanding, trying what the arguments are supposed to be doing. So every function, you'll see things like documentation strings where you'll see the name, the description, the type. And then ideally, I try to put an example. Depending on how I change things, obviously the examples might change a little bit themselves. And then I'll try to give you in the sense of what the optional arguments might be. I'll kind of explain how we handle this in the client. And then, just different things along that. So a lot of it's just the endpoints, explaining what the endpoint does, the arguments of the endpoint, and then probably the crux of it that we're going to be talking about, at least in the first couple of videos, is going to be related to not really the endpoints, but more the authentication aspect. So I would say starting, oh God, I can't even remember. Starting here, this is where we're going to start talking more about, hey, how do we initialize this client? What are the pieces of information we need in order to authenticate ourselves? How do we make sure if somebody passes through an argument that's not correct, how do we handle that? String representation, headers, API endpoints. So how do we take our API endpoints and make them a full URL? State manager. So this is going to be a really cool one. This is going to basically be able to do things like cache your API results and not API results, your access token and things along that nature. So again, that way you're not having to pass through your username and password every single time you want to use the API. Logging in, logging out, grabbing an access token. This is where it's going to try to do a silent authentication. And so really what that means is it's going to try to first authenticate using a refresh token. So that way, again, you don't have to log in. Token refresh, token save. So again, this is taking the token, updating all the attributes, and then saving it to a JSON file. And then also things like, validating the token by determining the number of seconds till expiration. And then obviously if the token's not valid, it's going to go out and request a new one. So that's really the crux of the authentication part. Additionally, we're going to be doing a lot of things, or at least in probably much further videos down the road, Uh, we're going to be doing different types of requests. And I'm sure most of you at this point now know that certain requests are easier than other requests. Some of those requests can get relatively complex pretty quickly. And so I really wanted to make the process of building those requests easier for everybody and, more importantly, consistent. So that way you're not having to do something like have 20 different dictionaries or having to update those dictionaries, because that's usually where the bulk of the errors kind of pop up. I've noticed with people, myself included, you miss a colon sometimes, or, oh, you missed this or you missed that. And so little things like that are the kind of gotchas that make your code not work. And then you're kind of sitting there scratching your head going, why is it not working? So the idea that I was kind of going forward with was, okay, well, how do we make this process more consistent, and how do we make it, I would say, easier for the user to do? Well, the idea is pretty simple for the most part. We're going to basically make certain requests to behave like objects. And so just kind of like almost in a sense like VBA a little bit, we're going to have certain items or certain objects that can be passed through to our request. And then the request endpoint will know how to handle those objects. So it will know, hey, this is how I get a JSON representation of that request, and things along that nature. More importantly, it's going to help validate the request that you're trying to build. So this kind of goes back to the complexity of the actual argument itself, or sorry, the actual request itself. Some requests are more complex than others. Some you only have to pass through 2 arguments. Some you have to pass through 15, but then if you pass through one of them, then the other 4 you can't pass through. These objects are going to help validate that request for you. So if you try to pass through, what is it, like an argument, like, before, if say you pass through like a start time, but you don't pass through an end time, then the object will let you know, hey, you can't do that. You've got to be able to send through both in order for this to be quote unquote a valid request. So it's going to have that built-in functionality where it's going to validate everything. And then what it's going to do is it's going to take the kind of the burden of creating that JSON string and do it for you. So it's going to basically just do all of that behind the scenes. And all you have to do is just pass through your arguments. So ideally, it's going to make that process easier. So there's going to be different objects for different endpoints. So we have watch list endpoints where we can get watch list, create watch list, and everything like that. So there's a dedicated object that is supposed to represent kind of like a watch list item. Additionally, you have the option chain endpoint. This, again, will do a lot of the same things. It's going to validate certain things for you. It's going to make sure if you need to add a key, you can do so in a very clean, consistent manner. If you need to return the JSON representation or a dictionary representation, it will do that for you. So all you need to do is create the object, pass through the object to the endpoint, and then guess what? It's going to do everything for you. So again, hopefully that reduces the amount of errors that people have. And then there's going to be more objects that are related to orders. Now, orders is a more complicated process because orders can be kind of, I would say, nested, to say the least. I'm still kind of thinking through that process about how I want to organize information, but you could kind of expect that an orders object will exist as well. So that way, if you want to create orders, you can do so in a relatively easy fashion, and it's going to be a lot more manageable. So at this point, this is kind of what everything is going to be looking like. There will also probably be a config file that I might post along with it. So the config file, just for testing purposes, I had a lot of my information in here, but then it's also going to have things like authentication URL, the authentication endpoint, the API URL, the API version, the token endpoint. So all the information we need in order to make a request to the API. Now, really, I don't need a config file. I probably could have just all of this inside the client object itself. But just so you know, the inspiration behind this library actually came from a library that Microsoft had developed for the Microsoft Graph API. So you'll see a lot of similarities between that library and my library. In fact, I'll probably put a link there just so you can kind of see what I took and what I changed and everything along that line. But overall, it was a really good library and it did exactly what we needed to do. We just had to change a couple different parts, remove unnecessary parts that don't really apply to our API. and then obviously add in different types of objects that will do different types of things, and then additionally different types of endpoints. So that's really kind of where all the inspiration has been coming from. And then ideally, what you're going to see here is this is where I started testing things. So this is where I've been testing all the different things. And I started doing this and I'm like, this is going to be really complicated. I don't want to do that. It'd be easier if I could just make an object. And so this is kind of where I was just testing it and realized like, oh, this is not going to work. But pretty cool stuff overall. I think it's definitely come a long way from where it started. But ideally, this is kind of what it would look like. All you would do is you would import your client object. You can obviously either manually type your credentials here, or you can import them from a config file. Here I have a file called config2, and then I have my account number and so on and so on. It looks identical to this one, but obviously this information is filled in. And then all you would do is you would log in, and then if you wanted to, you can do a certain request. So in this one, I'm doing the search instruments endpoint. I pass through the symbol that I want to, and then I also pass through the information that I want back. And then ideally too, hold on, I want to see if it does it. So this one will actually give you a nice IntelliSense description of everything. So that's really the cool thing about this. You now have, ooh, I don't like that, but that's okay. Well, that's just because it's long. But this is what it's supposed to be doing for you, is it's going to be able to have all this information here for you. That way you don't have to kind of sit there and guess like, oh, what's this doing? What's that doing? What's this doing? So ideally this will look a little bit cleaner once I kind of get all these strings formatted, because obviously it's not looking like that. But this is supposed to offer that IntelliSense, and then everything's going to have named arguments as well. So this one's like simple. But this is how you would pass through your arguments, and then you would just take the response of that endpoint, you put it in a variable, and then you do search data. So this is the really cool thing. So most time we've seen before like, oh, I've had to log in, right? Well, that's usually only your first time. After that, you can use a refresh token, but this will handle all of that behind the scenes for you. So all I have to do is I just run my Python file just like that. It's going to take all the information, and bam, it didn't ask me for any authentication or anything along that nature. So that's really kind of the cool part about this. It's making it easier to interact with that endpoint, and it's still doing everything exactly the same, but in a more structured format. So that way, people don't get lost, obviously, or, things along that nature. So again, in essence, that's really what the intent behind this library was. Again, first video, not too much coding. I really wanted to just give that context first before I started kind of jumping in and saying like, oh, okay, like what's going on? But before we actually start any real coding, what is the client need to do? So we understand what the API is. We understand what TD Ameritrade API offers us in the sense of data. But what do we need this client object to do when it comes to interacting with the API? Well, the most obvious one is authenticating ourselves, right? This API does require that we're authenticated. So ideally, what this client should be doing is, first, if you're a new person who's never used the API, or B, you're a person who has an expired access token, what it will do is it will prompt you to log in and then provide your authentication credentials. And then you, as a user, would take the URL, pass it back to the client object, and then it will take that URL and go make basically the second step of the authentication workflow, which means getting your access token. And then once it has all that information, it stores it in a JSON file that it can easily reference in future requests or future calls. And that way, what it will allow you to do is skip the part of having to log in and provide your credentials, because you have either you will have a valid access token that's not expired. And so if you don't have that, then what it would do is it would again prompt you for credentials. But as long as you have a valid access token, you shouldn't have to do that. So along with authenticating ourselves, it's supposed to save all this information to a JSON file that it can easily reference in case we don't want to have to authenticate ourselves or, anything along that information. Additionally, it's going to store certain information that we'll need in future API calls, things like your account number, things like your API key, things like the API URL, the API version. We want all this information centralized so that way if we ever had to change something, it's relatively easy to do that. And then additionally, we want it to give some control to the user where if they choose to not cache the results, or in other words, save their access token, they can do that. So again, giving more control to the user in that fashion. Additionally, there's going to be certain endpoints where we have different types of arguments. So kind of like our TD watchlist item object and option chain object, certain endpoints have required, well, not necessarily required parameters, but there are arguments that can only be a small set of possible values. What we want to make sure is before making that request that it is truly a valid request. So this little dictionary right here is supposed to help us through that process. Once we get to the request point, we'll see kind of how this is being used and leveraged. But all it's really doing at the end of the day is validating the arguments that you pass through match what the API is supposed to be expecting. It will also, the client, will also validate that any arguments you pass through are going to be used and are truly valid. If they're not valid, guess what? It's going to raise an error for you. So it's going to stop you before you try to make a mistake. And so what it will do is let you know, hey, this argument you just passed through is not a valid one, and then raise a key error. If it is good to go, then it's going to update your keyword arguments, and then it's going to start going through the state of of authenticating yourself and things along that nature. So a lot of stuff to it, but ideally it's going to make that workflow process pretty much all automated. So with that being said, let's get started. Oh, Lordy, here we go. Okay, first thing we need to do is got to import a bunch of libraries. We are going to be working with JSON strings heavily, so we need the JSON library. The OS. Yes, we do need the OS library because there is a portion where we're going to create a JSON file. We want to make sure that that JSON file exists before we start dumping data into it. We also want to import the time library. Oh wait, I don't think I need that one. Well, I'll keep it for right now. To be honest, I don't know. I can't remember necessarily what all libraries I need. It's gotten so messy. It's fun to say the least. We might need the time library at some point. Additionally, we're going to be doing a lot of URL parsing. And so we need a library that will help us parse information for us. And so we're going to do a couple things. We're going to first import urllib.parse. And so this will again help us through the parsing process. And then again, we're going to import from URL lib. From the parse, we want to import URL parse. And so again, this will help us parse URLs. Again, this is more related to the authentication point because again, we have a URL that we have to copy back into the command prompt. And so we need to parse that URL. We also will be making some requests. And so we'll be using the URL lib for that. And then this one, I'll be honest, we don't really need it, I think, in our case, but I'm keeping it for right now. This is basically like a random number generator. It seemed like the Microsoft Graph library was using this because I think the request actually needed it, if I remember correctly. In our case, we probably don't need it. I've been kind of experimenting a little bit and just taking it off and see what happens. I haven't had any issues so far, so I really don't think we need it. I'm going to do a little bit more research on it just to verify, but at this point, I'd say you probably don't need it. Okay, and then additionally, we'll also be doing, again, more requests, so we're going to be using the request library to do that as well. And then finally, we are going to import our config2 file. And then this one, this is, again, kind of a special one, but really all it is, oh, did I misspell? Oh, God. It's okay, it's fine. I should have kept it config, I didn't want to config too, but regardless, this contains things like my username, my password, things like that. So again, for authentication purposes, I really wouldn't encourage you to do this. You really kind of should have this separate. I wouldn't want to be storing all this information in the actual library itself. You would want to do that when you're actually testing the client. But things for like, the authentication URL, things that are relatively static that won't be changing, that is okay to put in the config file. But honestly, again, you probably could just put it in the client object and you would be relatively okay. So probably the code I post on GitHub, you'll probably won't even see a config file. You'll just see it all in the client. But when I was testing it, I kind of wanted to keep it as consistent with the Microsoft one initially. So they had a config file, so I had a config file. Alrighty. So those are all the libraries that we're going to be using at this point. Now we're going to start building our client object. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do and create a new class object. We're going to call it TD client. Put your little curves, put your colon, you're good to go. Okay, so when we're building a class object, certain things we want to have happen when we initialize it. When we talk about initialization, we mean, hey, we're going to create a new instance of it. And so when we create a new instance of it, we want to do all these XYZ things behind the scenes. And so in order to do that, we're going to use something called a dunder method. And so that's kind of short for double underscore method. And so there's a special one called init. And basically every time we initialize a new instance of an object or of this particular object, it will run through all the steps that we define within it. So that's basically what the init dunder method does, is it's going to initialize our particular session in a sense, and then what it's going to do with that session is it's going to do things like pull in information from our config file. It's going to go through and log us in or things along that nature. It's going to make sure that certain parameters are tuned or set correctly, so that way when we do future calls, everything's kind of set up. So you can think of the initialization as setting things up for future things. So really interesting thing about this, we're not going to actually specify any named arguments. We're just going to use the kwargs parameter. And what that really means is that there's just going to be multiple keyword arguments. So kwargs is short for keyword arguments. And we will handle this down below. So in case somebody passes through an argument that isn't a valid one, we will handle that by defining our config attribute that belongs to our client object. So a couple of things though, again, just to be kind of clear, because we are creating a class object and because we are defining a method that belongs to our class object, we want to make sure we pass the self argument. So this basically means referring to the object itself. And this way, we basically are assigning it to the object itself. So that way we can call it from the object. This way, I mean, this is basically the tradition behind it. I have a whole video series dedicated to class objects. When we get there, we get there. But at this point, you just want to make sure you pass through the self keyword argument because we are defining a method that belongs to this client. And then this way too, if I want to access this method somewhere else in my class object, I can do so. If I don't define the self argument, then basically what I'm saying is like, oh, it's not really belonging to it, so you don't need to access it anywhere else from the client. So that's where this part kind of starts out with. So let me look at the time really quick. Ooh, 23. Yeah, I'll cut it off here. So in the next video, we're going to basically finish up the init dunder method. So we're going to get everything set up there. And then I think the next thing that we have started is the string representation of our client object. So that's kind of coming up next. At this point, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down below. I'll try to answer them if I can. And then also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate support. And if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates. Good news, we made 3,000. That has been crazy, first of all. So that is awesome to see. Thank you again, everybody, for the support. I think this has been phenomenal progress. I'm way ahead of schedule in that regard. So I'm really excited to see kind of what is to come down the road. But just so you guys are aware, we are definitely picking up momentum as a channel. I would say the last 2 months, we got close to 1,000 subscribers. So pretty cool stuff. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.